The sound of sizzling bacon filled the air as Christian flipped another slice in the pan. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the bustling scene. His son, Miles, was hunched over the kitchen table, building a Lego spaceship, while his daughter, Gracie, painted a picture of a family. Her depiction of their family, he noted with pride. "Dad, can you make mine extra crispy?" Miles asked, not looking up from his creation. "Anything for the future astronaut," Christian replied, his voice light. He turned to Gracie, who was furiously dipping her brush into a palette of bright colors. "And what's my little Picasso making today?" Gracie beamed. "It's us. See? That's you, and that's Mommy, and that's Miles and me." She pointed at a smiling stick-figure family, complete with a yellow sun beaming down. Claire appeared in the doorway, her robe loosely tied around her waist. Her hair was still damp from her shower, and she smelled faintly of lavender. Christian turned and smiled at her, flipping the last piece of bacon onto a plate. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, leaning over to kiss her cheek. "Breakfast is almost ready." "You spoil me," Claire said with a soft laugh, though her eyes darted briefly toward the floor. "I don't know what I did to deserve you." "Stop it, you charmer," she replied, playfully swatting his arm. But as Christian turned back to the stove, her smile faded for just a moment, replaced by something unreadable. The expression was gone as quickly as it appeared, and Christian missed it entirely. After breakfast, the family moved to the living room, where a Saturday tradition unfolded. Miles and Gracie were locked in a competitive game of Mario Kart on the TV, their laughter and mock arguments filling the room. Christian leaned back on the couch, his arm around Claire, feeling a sense of contentment. I think we're pretty lucky," Christian said, watching the kids. Claire nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We are." The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Miles leaped off the couch. "I'll get it," he shouted, racing toward the door. Christian chuckled. "Bet it's your brother," Claire said, sitting up. There was a faint edge to her voice, but Christian didn't notice. Miles returned, followed by Nicholas, Christian's younger brother. Nicholas was carrying a six-pack of beer and wearing his trademark smirk. "What's up, big brother?" Nicholas said, clapping Christian on the back. "Thought I'd swing by. You've got the perfect family, so I figured I'd leech off some of that good karma." "Perfect timing," Christian said, standing to greet him. "We just finished breakfast. You want a plate?" Nicholas waved him off. "Nah, I'm good. Just here to hang out with my favorite nephew and niece." "Uncle Nicholas." Gracie squealed, running over to hug him. Miles followed, holding up his Lego creation. "Look what I made," Miles said. "Whoa, that's awesome," Nicholas said, crouching down to inspect the spaceship. "You're going to be the next Elon Musk, kid." Christian watched the scene with a smile. Nicholas always had a way with the kids. They adored him, and he seemed to enjoy their company as much as they enjoyed his. Still, there was something about Nicholas's easy charm that occasionally made Christian feel overshadowed. But he brushed the thought aside. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and conversation. Nicholas stayed for lunch, telling stories about his adventures as a bachelor. "So, there I was stuck on this godforsaken hiking trail, no cell service, and a flat tire on my bike," Nicholas said, gesturing animatedly. "I had to hike 5 miles back to civilization. Let me tell you, nothing makes you rethink your life choices like having a raccoon stare you down in the middle of the woods." Claire laughed, her eyes sparkling as she listened. Christian noticed how easily Nicholas commanded the room, his stories captivating everyone. "You should have called me," Christian joked. "I would have driven out there and saved you from the raccoon." "Oh, come on, Christian. I can handle a raccoon," Nicholas said with a grin. The banter continued, but Christian couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a nagging sensation in the back of his mind. He chalked it up to jealousy. Nicholas had always been the charismatic one, the guy everyone gravitated toward. But Christian knew he had something Nicholas didn't: a loving wife and a beautiful family. Later that evening, after Nicholas had left, Christian and Claire tucked the kids into bed. Miles was already half asleep by the time Christian finished reading his story, while Gracie insisted on one more picture for her family collection. "Good night, sweetie," Christian said, kissing her forehead. "Good night, Daddy," she said, her voice drowsy. I love you. I love you too, Christian said, his heart full. In the master bedroom, Christian found Claire sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. Long day, he said, collapsing onto the mattress beside her. You're telling me, Claire said, setting the phone down. You okay? Christian asked, noticing the distant look in her eyes. Claire hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. Christian nodded, pulling her into his arms. I don't say this enough, but I'm really lucky to have you, he said. Claire stiffened slightly, but quickly relaxed. I'm lucky to have you too, she whispered. As they lay there in the quiet, Christian felt a sense of peace. But Claire stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't share. The next morning, the routine began again. Christian kissed Claire goodbye before heading to work. Miles and Gracie waved from the window, and everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, cracks Christian wouldn't see until it was too late. The office was unusually quiet that afternoon. Christian's boss had canceled the meeting at the last minute, leaving Christian with an unexpected free afternoon. As he drove home, he thought about how surprised Claire and the kids would be to see him so early. He imagined the look on Claire's face when he walked in, unannounced. When he pulled into the driveway, Christian noticed how peaceful the house looked in the afternoon light. He stepped out of the car, carefully closing the door without a slam. His briefcase swung at his side as he walked to the front door, which was slightly ajar. Odd, he thought. Claire usually kept the door locked. He stepped inside quietly, hoping to surprise her. But before he could call out, he froze. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low and urgent. Christian hesitated, his hand still gripping the doorknob. You have to make sure Christian never finds out, his mother, Margaret, said. Her voice was sharp, carrying an edge of authority. Christian frowned. What could they possibly be talking about? He moved closer, careful to stay out of sight. I know, but the guilt is eating me alive, Claire whispered back, her voice trembling. Christian's breath caught in his throat. Guilt? What guilt? You can't afford guilt right now, Margaret hissed. Do you want to ruin everything? He loves those kids so much. If he finds out, Margaret stopped mid-sentence, and Christian heard a chair scrape against the floor. He pressed his back against the wall, his mind racing. Find out what? What could they be hiding from him? Margaret, it's getting harder, Claire said, her voice cracking. Every time I look at him, I feel like the worst person in the world. Christian's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the blood rushing to his ears as fragments of their conversation began to form a terrifying picture. Then stop thinking about it, Margaret said bluntly. Do you want to destroy this family? Do you want to see Christian walk away from those kids? Christian's stomach churned. He leaned forward slightly, desperate to hear every word. I don't want to destroy anything, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can't keep pretending forever. Listen to me, Margaret said firmly. You don't have a choice. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. If you tell Christian, you'll lose him. The kids will lose him. Is that what you want? Christian's hand gripped the edge of the wall, his knuckles white. His mind replayed Margaret's words. The kids will lose him. Why would the kids lose him? What was Claire pretending about? I hate lying to him, Claire said, her voice breaking. You should have thought of that before, Margaret snapped. What's done is done. The only thing you can do now is make sure he never finds out. The sound of footsteps startled Christian, and he quickly backed away, slipping into the hallway. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of confusion, anger, and fear. Claire's voice softened as she spoke again. I just hope I can live with myself. You'll have to, Margaret said flatly, because if he finds out, we'll all lose everything. Christian stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what he'd just heard. He felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, like everything he thought he knew about his life was now in question. What were they hiding? What was Claire pretending about? And why did Margaret sound so adamant that the truth could ruin everything? For a moment, Christian considered walking into the kitchen and confronting them right then and there. He could demand answers, force them to explain what was going on, but something held him back. Instead, he turned and walked quietly out of the house, his his movements careful and deliberate. He stepped onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him. Christian sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. He stared out the windshield, his mind racing. He thought about Claire's laughter, the way she smiled at him every morning. He thought about Margaret's insistence on family unity, how she'd always been so protective of their bond. He thought about the kids, their faces lighting up every time he came home. And then he thought about the whispers, the guilt in Claire's voice, and the cold finality in Margaret's words. Christian clenched his jaw. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Something was wrong, something big, and he wasn't going to let it slide. He pulled out his phone and opened a note, typing quickly. DNA test for Miles and Gracie. How to get samples discreetly. He stared at the words for a long moment before closing the note and shoving the phone back into his pocket. He started the car and drove aimlessly, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The idea of confronting Claire and Margaret tugged at him, but he knew he needed more information. If he barged in without proof, they'd deny everything. They'd brush it off, make him feel like he was imagining things. No, Christian decided. He needed to be smart about this. Whatever they were hiding, he'd find out. And when he did, he'd be ready. For now, he drove in silence, the weight of what he'd overheard pressing down on him. The perfect life he thought he had was crumbling, and he didn't even know why. But one thing was certain, the truth would come out. It always did. Christian sat in his car outside the clinic, staring at the plain, white envelope in his lap. Inside was the truth, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to open it. For the past week, he'd lived in a fog of denial and suspicion, gathering DNA samples from Miles and Gracie in the most discreet ways he could manage. It had been a surreal process, plucking a stray hair from Gracie's brush, collecting a napkin Miles had wiped his face with. He justified it to himself by repeating the same mantra. I need to know. I deserve to know. Now the results were in his hands, and his stomach churned with dread. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he tore open the envelope. The clinic's logo was at the top of the page, followed by lines of text and percentages. His eyes scanned the document, jumping to the section that mattered most. Probability of paternity, 0%. The words blurred as Christian's vision swam. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what he was seeing. He flipped to the next page, Gracie's results. Probability of paternity, 0%. Christian's hands began to shake. He let the papers fall to the passenger seat, leaning back against the headrest. The world outside felt too bright, too loud, as if it were mocking the darkness swelling inside him. It wasn't a mistake. It couldn't be. The DNA test didn't lie. Miles and Gracie weren't his kids. They were Nicholas's. Christian's mind replayed the moments that had once seemed so innocent, so ordinary, but now felt like damning evidence. He remembered the way Claire and Nicholas had exchanged glances at family gatherings, their eyes lingering just a fraction too long. At the time, he'd brushed it off as nothing more than a close sibling-in-law relationship, but now it felt like betrayal painted in neon lights. He thought about Margaret's constant insistence on family unity. Family is everything, she would say, her voice dripping with conviction. Now he understood why she had been so determined to keep the family together. She'd known all along. Even the kids' behavior began to take on a new, bitter meaning. The way Miles idolized Nicholas, hanging on to his every word. The way Gracie's eyes lit up when Nicholas walked into the room. Christian had once been proud of the bond they shared with their uncle. Now it felt like a cruel joke. Back at home, Christian sat at the dining table, the DNA results spread out in front of him. His fists clenched as waves of anger and heartbreak crashed over him. You played me like a fool, he muttered under his breath. His voice was low, dangerous. Claire's laughter echoed in his memory, soft, sweet, and now so fake. Nicholas's easy charm, the way he'd always been able to win people over. Margaret's thinly veiled manipulation, her constant interference under the guise of love. Christian's hands slammed against the table, the sound reverberating through the empty room. He stared at the results, his jaw tightening. They all knew, he said to himself, his voice growing louder. Every single one of them knew, and they lied to me. For years, he stood abruptly, pacing the room. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, rage at their betrayal, grief for the life he thought he had, and a deep, gnawing pain at the thought of losing the children he had loved so fiercely. But the pain was quickly swallowed by anger. They think they've won, Christian muttered, his fists clenching at his sides. They think they've gotten away with it. A cold determination settled over him. He wasn't going to confront them, not yet. Not until he was ready. The next day, Christian went about his routine as if nothing had happened. He kissed Claire on the cheek before heading to work, smiled at Miles and Gracie as they waved from the window, and even exchanged a casual text with Nicholas about an upcoming barbecue. Every interaction felt like a knife to the heart, but Christian kept his composure. He couldn't let them see the storm brewing inside him. At work, he began sketching out a plan. He jotted down notes in a small, leather-bound notebook, ideas for how to untangle himself from the web of lies they had spun around him. Financial accounts he needed to secure, assets he needed to protect, and legal avenues he could explore. He met with a lawyer under the pretense of discussing business matters, slipping in questions about custody, property division, and infidelity. "What if the children aren't biologically mine?" Christian asked, his voice steady. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "In that case, you wouldn't have any legal obligation to them, assuming you can prove paternity or lack thereof." Christian nodded, filing the information away. At home, Christian began observing Claire and Nicholas more closely. He paid attention to the way Claire's smile seemed a little too forced when she talked about their future. The way her phone would light up with notifications that she quickly swiped away. One evening, while Claire was in the shower, Christian scrolled through her phone. He hated himself for doing it, but he needed to know. The messages were damning. Texts from Nicholas, hidden under the name Lydia, were laced with inside jokes, familiar nicknames, and phrases that made Christian's stomach churn. "Can't stop thinking about last weekend. He has no idea, does he? I love you." Christian's grip on the phone tightened. He placed it back on the nightstand and stepped out of the room, his chest heaving. By the end of the week, Christian had pieced together enough to confirm what he already knew. The affair had been going on for years, long enough that there was no question about who Miles and Gracie's father was. Christian sat in his office, staring at the DNA results and a printout of the messages he'd found on Claire's phone. His reflection in the window looked tired, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "They think I'm just going to roll over," he said to himself, his voice steady. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." He thought about everything he'd sacrificed for his family, the late nights at work, the vacations he'd postponed, the dreams he'd put on hold. "Not anymore," Christian said, his voice hard. "It's my turn now." He closed the folder and placed it in the safe he'd installed in his office. Then he leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They had their secrets. Now I have mine. Christian sat in his office late into the night, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop screen. The DNA test results and Claire's text messages sat in a folder on the desk, untouched but omnipresent. He hadn't confronted Claire, Nicholas, or even Margaret. The time for confrontation, Christian had decided, would come later when it was on his terms. Instead, he focused on the immediate task, disappearing. He needed to get out of this tangled mess without leaving anything behind that they could use against him. Christian knew that staying would mean more lies, more betrayal, and more pain. The first step was financial. Christian spent days quietly shifting funds to a new account under a name no one in his family would recognize. He cashed out small amounts from joint accounts daily, ensuring it looked like routine expenses. He also contacted a lawyer he trusted outside of town, explaining vaguely that he was preparing for future contingencies. "I need you to handle this discreetly," Christian said, leaning forward in the lawyer's office. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Discretion is my specialty. What are we looking at here? Divorce, separation?" Christian smiled faintly. "Just an exit strategy. Let's leave it at that." Back home, Christian began removing traces of himself. He sorted through his belongings late at night, while Claire slept upstairs. Clothes, photographs, personal trinkets, all went into boxes that he either donated or disposed of. He left just enough behind to keep up appearances. One night, While rifling through a drawer in the garage, he found an old family photo. Claire, Miles, and Gracie were smiling at the camera, with Nicholas standing off to the side. Christian stared at it for a long moment before tearing the picture in half and throwing it into the trash. The day before he left, Christian made one final check. His car was packed with essentials, clothes, documents, and enough cash to last him until he got settled elsewhere. He found a small apartment in another city under a different name. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough to start over. That night, Christian wrote a letter. It was short, deliberate, and cold. "Don't look for me. I'll never come back. I hope Nicholas is worth it." He folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter, right next to Claire's coffee mug. He stood there for a moment, staring at the note, imagining her reaction. Would she cry? Would she run to Nicholas? Would she even care? The thought made him clench his fists. "It doesn't matter," he muttered to himself. "I'm done." The next morning, Christian slipped out of the house before dawn. The air was crisp, and the streets were quiet. He took one last look at the house, the home he had built, the life he had poured everything into. "Goodbye," he said under his breath, then turned and walked to his car without looking back. The first few weeks in the new city were a blur. Christian threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects and networking relentlessly. His pain became his fuel, driving him to succeed at a level he hadn't thought possible. He rented a modest apartment, keeping his expenses low while he focused on growing his savings. He worked long hours, often staying in the office until midnight. On weekends, he attended seminars, met potential investors, and built connections. The anger and betrayal that had once consumed him began to morph into a cold determination. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. A year into his new life, Christian's efforts began to pay off. He landed a major contract with a tech company, earning him a significant commission. That deal was the catalyst for everything that followed. He started his own consulting firm, using the skills he'd honed over the years to help other businesses grow. The money started rolling in. Christian upgraded from his modest apartment to a sleek condo overlooking the city skyline. He bought a new car, invested in stocks, and even began traveling occasionally. But despite his newfound success, Christian kept a low profile. He avoided social media, rarely shared personal details, and made sure his name was never connected to anything that could lead Claire or Nicholas to him. 7 years passed, and Christian had become a self-made millionaire. His consulting firm was thriving, and he had built a life of peace and freedom. One evening, as he sipped whiskey on the balcony of his condo, he thought back to the life he'd left behind. He wondered how Claire was doing, if Nicholas had stepped up as a father, if Margaret was still orchestrating the family dynamics. He felt no desire to reach out. Whatever their lives looked like now, it wasn't his concern. Christian leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. The knock at Christian's door was sharp, almost impatient. He was in the middle of a quiet evening, savoring the calm he had built over the last 7 years. The interruption was unwelcome, but his curiosity got the better of him. When he opened the door, the sight before him sent a ripple of disbelief through his carefully constructed peace. Standing on his porch were Miles and Gracie, now teenagers, flanked by Claire and Margaret. Claire looked older, worn, and visibly uneasy, while Margaret held the same self-righteous air she always had. Miles, now 19 and nearly as tall as Christian, was the first to speak. "Dad," he said flatly, as if the word was a formality. "I need money for college." Gracie, who stood next to him in a crisp dress, chimed in, "And I'm getting married. We need you to pay for the wedding." Christian raised an eyebrow, his eyes flickering from the kids to Claire, whose hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Her lips trembled as she finally spoke. "Please, Christian, they're still your children. You can't just turn your back on them." Christian let out a low chuckle, stepping back from the door. "Children, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "All right, come in. Let's have a chat." He gestured for them to sit in the living room. They hesitated, clearly unnerved by his calm demeanor, but eventually filed in. Margaret perched stiffly on the edge of a chair, while Claire sat on the couch beside Gracie. Miles leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as if to remind everyone he was no longer a child. Christian took his time, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He leaned against the counter, watching them like a predator sizing up its prey. "So, let me get this straight," he began. "You show up here, unannounced after 7 years, and the first words out of your mouths are about money." Gracie frowned. "We didn't know where else to go," she said defensively. "You're our dad." Christian took a sip of his drink, smirking. "Dad. Interesting choice of words." The room grew quiet. Claire's eyes darted to Margaret, who sat with her lips pursed. Miles shifted uncomfortably, but Gracie leaned forward, her tone growing sharper. "You disappeared. You abandoned us. Don't you think you owe us something?" Christian set his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Owe you? That's funny. Let me tell you what I owe you, nothing." Claire's voice cracked as she cut in. "Christian, stop. They don't know. They're just kids." "Kids?" Christian shot back, his voice rising. "They're practically adults. They're old enough to know the truth." Christian strode across the room to a cabinet, pulling out a folder he hadn't opened in years. He placed it on the coffee table and flipped it open, revealing the DNA results. "You want the truth? Here it is," he said, sliding the papers toward Miles and Gracie. They stared at the documents, confusion spreading across their faces. "What's this supposed to mean?" Miles asked, his brow furrowing. Christian's smirk widened. "It means I'm not your father. I'm your uncle." Gracie's face paled. "What?" she whispered. Christian leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "Your real father is Nicholas. You know, your charming uncle who couldn't keep his hands off my wife. And your lovely mother here." He gestured to Claire, decided I was a better financial backup plan. "Grandma?" He turned to Margaret. "She knew the whole time, didn't you?" Margaret's face flushed red. "Christian, don't what?" Christian cut her off. "Don't tell the truth? Don't expose the lies you've all been feeding me for years?" "Sorry, Margaret, but that ship sailed the moment you showed up at my door." The room fell into stunned silence. Claire's hands flew to her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Christian, I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Christian's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What does that even mean, Claire? You don't accidentally have an affair with your husband's brother. You don't accidentally lie about the paternity of your kids for years." Miles stood abruptly, the papers crumpled in his hand. "So what, you're just going to abandon us because of something we didn't do?" he snapped. Christian's eyes narrowed. "I didn't abandon you, Miles. I was lied to. I was made to believe I was your father, and I poured everything I had into raising you and Gracie. But the truth? The truth is that your mother and Nicholas stole that from me." Gracie's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "We didn't ask for this. And I didn't ask to be betrayed by the people I trusted most," Christian replied, his tone softening slightly. "But here we are." Margaret, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Christian, you're punishing the wrong people. The kids didn't choose this, and neither did I. I was only trying to protect the family." Christian turned on her, his voice sharp. "Protect the family? Is that what you call it? Covering up an affair, lying to my face, and letting me raise someone else's children? You weren't protecting anyone, Margaret. You were enabling them." Claire reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Please, Christian," she begged. "I know I hurt you, but don't punish the kids for my mistakes." Christian shook his head, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about punishment, Claire. It's about accountability. Nicholas is their father. Let him step up for once. Let him pay for the wedding and the tuition. You and Margaret made sure he stayed in their lives. Now let him handle the responsibilities that come with it." Miles and Gracie exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of anger and disbelief. "So that's it?" Miles asked. "You're just going to turn us away?" Christian sighed, his voice heavy. "I'm not your father, Miles. I'm sorry for what that means for you, but it's the truth. If you want someone to blame, look at the people who lied to all of us." Gracie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say another word. She stood, pulling Miles with her. Claire and Margaret stayed behind, their eyes pleading. "Christian, we can fix this," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Christian shook his head. There's nothing to fix. You broke it a long time ago. Without another word, he opened the door, gesturing for them to leave. One by one, they filed out, their faces etched with defeat. As the door clicked shut behind them, Christian exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt free. The sound of Claire pounding on the door echoed through the house. Christian stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door he had just shut in their faces. The muffled voices from outside grew louder, filled with desperation. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before swinging the door open again. Claire stood there, tears streaming down her face, her entire body trembling. Margaret hovered behind her, looking indignant but shaken, while Miles and Gracie stood awkwardly to the side, anger and confusion written all over their faces. Claire took a shaky step forward, her voice cracking. "Christian, please. I'm sorry. I was young and stupid. I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted things to turn out this way." Christian folded his arms, his expression icy. "Oh, you didn't mean to hurt me?" he said, his voice low and biting. "That's rich, Claire. You lied to me every single day for years. You let me wake up every morning thinking I was a father to kids that weren't even mine. You're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry I found out." Claire choked on a sob, her hands clutching at her chest, as if she could physically hold herself together. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I was scared of losing you, scared of breaking up our family." Christian let out a bitter laugh. "Our family? Claire, there was no family. It was all a lie. A twisted little game you and Nicholas played, with Margaret cheering you on from the sidelines." Margaret stepped forward, her tone sharp and defensive. "Christian, that's enough. We all make mistakes. You're not perfect either." Christian turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Mistakes? You call this a mistake, Margaret? You helped Claire cover it up. You knew the whole time, and you said nothing. Don't stand there and preach about imperfection like you're some kind of martyr." Margaret's face flushed with anger. "I was trying to keep the family together. Do you know how much worse it would have been if you had found out back then? I was protecting you." Christian took a step closer to her, his voice rising. "Protecting me? No, you were protecting them. You didn't care about me. You cared about keeping their secret, about maintaining this illusion so no one would have to face the consequences. Well, guess what? The truth is out, and I'm done playing the fool." Miles, who had been silent until now, suddenly erupted. "You can't just abandon us," he shouted, his fists clenched. "You raised us. You're the only dad we've ever known. How can you just walk away?" Christian's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He turned to Miles, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't abandon you, Miles. I was lied to. I was manipulated into believing I was your father. I gave you everything I had, and I loved you like my own. But the truth is, you were never mine to begin with." Gracie's voice broke as she joined in, her eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know, Dad. We didn't ask for this. Please don't punish us for what Mom and Uncle Nicholas did." Christian's jaw tightened. He looked at Gracie, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of her words. But then he remembered the years of lies, the stolen moments, the betrayal that had left him hollow. "I'm not punishing you," he said quietly, "but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep playing the role of the doting father when the foundation of that relationship was built on lies." Claire dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Christian, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, for the kids' sake. They need you. They love you." Christian stepped back, shaking his head. "They needed the truth, Claire, and now they have it. I've done my part. I gave them everything I could. But this..." He gestured around the room, his voice breaking slightly. "This isn't my mess to clean up. It's yours." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're being selfish, Christian. You're acting like a victim when you should be stepping up for those kids." Christian spun around to face her, his fury barely contained. "Selfish? You have the audacity to call me selfish? I gave everything to this family. I worked myself to the bone to provide for those kids, to give them a life I thought they deserved. Meanwhile, you were sitting on this secret, letting me play house while everyone else knew the truth. If anyone here is selfish, it's you. Miles stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. So, that's it? You're just going to throw us away because of something we didn't do? Fine. I don't need you. Christian's expression hardened. It's not about throwing you away, Miles. It's about moving on. I've spent the last 7 years building a life free from lies and betrayal. I won't let you, or anyone else, drag me back into that. Gracie grabbed Claire's arm, trying to pull her up. Mom, let's just go, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He doesn't care about us anymore. Claire resisted, reaching out toward Christian one last time. Please, Christian, don't do this. We can fix this. We can be a family again. Christian stared at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. There's nothing to fix, Claire. You broke it a long time ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire collapsed into Margaret's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Miles stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, while Gracie followed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Margaret lingered for a moment, glaring at Christian. You'll regret this, she said, her voice low and venomous. Christian met her gaze without flinching. No, Margaret. I regret trusting any of you. Now, get out of my house. With that, Margaret turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. Christian stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. He felt a pang of something, regret, anger, maybe even sadness, but it was quickly swallowed by the relief of knowing it was over. He closed the door, locking it behind him, and walked back to his living room. Picking up his glass of whiskey, he sank into his favorite chair and stared out the window. For the first time in years, he felt like he could finally breathe. Christian sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. His finger hovered over the mouse, the cursor positioned over an email draft he'd spent weeks crafting. He read it over one last time, ensuring every word was precise, factual, and devastating. The email wasn't just an accusation. It was a bombshell, loaded with screenshots of the DNA results, details of the affair, and Claire and Margaret's involvement in covering it up. The recipients included family members, friends, and even Nicholas's boss. Christian leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. He could feel the weight of what he was about to do, but it didn't deter him. They didn't think twice about destroying me. Why should I? He muttered under his breath. With a calm exhale, he clicked send. By the next morning, the fallout had begun. Christian's phone buzzed with notifications, angry texts, shocked emails, and missed calls. He ignored them all. He could imagine the chaos unfolding without needing to see it firsthand. Claire called first, her voice frantic. Christian, what did you do? Everyone's calling me, my parents, my friends. What did you tell them? Christian smirked, though his voice remained cold and even. I told them the truth, Claire. Something you and Nicholas never managed to do. Don't worry, I kept it professional. Just facts, no embellishments. You ruined us? Claire cried, her voice breaking. No, Claire, Christian replied calmly. You ruined yourselves. I just held up a mirror. He hung up, blocking her number before she could call again. The next wave hit when Nicholas's employer contacted him. Christian had made sure the email reached Nicholas's boss, detailing how Nicholas's unprofessional conduct extended to his personal life. The company had a strict policy about maintaining workplace integrity, and Nicholas's affair painted a very public stain on that image. Nicholas showed up at Christian's doorstep later that evening, his face red with anger. He banged on the door, shouting, Christian, open the damn door. Christian took his time, deliberately making Nicholas wait before finally opening it. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. What do you want? You had no right to do this. Nicholas yelled, stepping forward aggressively. Christian didn't flinch. No, right? You slept with my wife, lied to me for years, and let me raise your kids. And now you're upset because people know the truth? Grow up, Nicholas. Nicholas's fists clenched. You cost me my job, Christian. I'm being blacklisted because of you. Christian shrugged, his tone dismissive. Actions have consequences. Maybe next time, don't sleep with your brother's wife. Oh, wait. You won't have a next time, will you? Nobody trusts a snake. Nicholas glared at him, his face twisted with rage. But he knew better than to escalate further. Without another word, he stormed off, slamming the gate behind him. The public exposure quickly tore apart the fragile world Claire and Nicholas had built. Family members called Claire to express their disgust, and mutual friends distanced themselves from both her and Nicholas. Margaret, who had always prided herself on maintaining the family's image, found herself shunned at social gatherings. Christian's next move was cutting off any financial ties. Claire had been relying on the alimony Christian had agreed to after their divorce, but he found a legal loophole to have it revoked, citing her fraudulent actions. When Claire tried to fight it in court, Christian's lawyer dismantled her arguments with ease, presenting the DNA results as evidence of her deception. The judge ruled in Christian's favor. Claire left the courtroom pale and trembling, barely able to look Christian in the eye. Miles and Gracie weren't spared from the storm either. They had always idolized Nicholas, seeing him as the fun, carefree uncle who brought laughter into their lives. But now, they knew the truth, that Nicholas was their biological father and had betrayed Christian, the man who had raised them. Miles confronted Nicholas during one of his rare visits. "How could you do this to him?" "To us," he demanded, his voice shaking. Nicholas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Miles, it's complicated." "No, it's not." Miles cut him off. "You slept with Mom, and you let him raise us like we were his. You're a coward, and you don't deserve to be called a father." Gracie, standing nearby, didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. She refused to speak to Nicholas entirely, walking out of the room whenever he tried to approach her. Margaret, desperate to mend the broken family, called Christian one last time. "Christian, please," she began, her voice strained. "We're falling apart. Can't we just talk? I know we've made mistakes, but we're still family." Christian let out a humorless laugh. "Family? You're kidding, right? You don't get to call me family after everything you've done." "I was trying to protect everyone," Margaret said weakly. "No," Christian replied sharply. "You were trying to protect a lie. And now that it's come crashing down, you want me to clean up the mess?" "Not happening." Margaret tried again, her tone shifting to pleading. "But what about the kids? Don't they deserve better?" Christian's voice softened, but only slightly. "They deserve the truth, Margaret. And they got it. What they do with it is up to them." As the weeks passed, Christian watched from a distance as their lives unraveled. Claire struggled to find work, her reputation tainted by the scandal. Nicholas bounced between short-term jobs, unable to hold anything stable. Margaret, once the glue holding the family together, became a recluse, avoiding the judgmental stares of neighbors and former friends. Christian, on the other hand, flourished. He continued building his business, expanding it into new markets. He traveled, met new people, and began exploring the possibility of love again with someone who valued honesty and integrity. One evening, as he sat on his balcony with a glass of wine, Christian reflected on everything that had happened. There was no joy in their suffering, but there was a sense of justice, a balance restored. He had been broken, betrayed, and humiliated, but he had risen from the ashes, stronger and wiser. And now, as the sun set on another peaceful day, he finally felt free. Christian stretched out on the patio of his new home, sipping coffee as the morning sun warmed his face. His home overlooked a small lake, the water glistening in the early light. It had been months since the chaos of his past had finally settled, and for the first time in years, peace felt real. He glanced at his phone. A message from his business partner confirmed their latest venture success. Smiling to himself, Christian stood and walked inside, setting the mug on the kitchen counter. Life was simpler now. No more lies, no more betrayal, just calm and purpose. That afternoon, Christian attended a charity gala hosted by a local foundation. He hadn't planned to stay long, but decided to mingle for a bit. While he scanned the room, his eyes landed on a woman across the hall. She wasn't flashy or overdone, just elegant in a simple navy dress. Her auburn hair framed her face, and her soft smile caught his attention. Christian approached her cautiously. "Mind if I interrupt?" he asked, gesturing to the drink she held. She looked up, surprised but amused. "That depends. Are you trying to sell me something?" He chuckled. "No sales pitch, I promise. Just thought I'd say hi." "I'm Christian Collins," she replied, extending her hand. Nice to meet you, Christian. What brings you here tonight? They fell into easy conversation, talking about their mutual interest in supporting local charities and their favorite travel destinations. Collins was witty and genuine, a refreshing change from the superficial interactions Christian had grown used to. So, tell me, Collins said, tilting her head curiously, why does a man like you seem so guarded? Christian hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Let's just say I've learned the hard way to be careful about who I trust. But I'm working on it. Collins nodded, her expression thoughtful. Well, trust is earned, right? Maybe you just haven't found the right person to earn it yet. Something about her words stuck with him. For the first time in years, Christian felt a spark of hope. Over the next few months, Christian and Collins grew closer. She wasn't pushy or overbearing. She let Christian open up at his own pace. One evening, they sat by the fire pit in Christian's backyard, sharing a bottle of wine. You know, Collins began, swirling her glass, you've never told me much about your past. Not that you have to, but I'm curious. Christian stared at the fire, the flames dancing in his reflection. He took a deep breath. I was married once. Thought I had the perfect life. Turned out, my wife was having an affair with my brother. They let me raise kids that weren't even mine. Collins's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. Christian continued. When I found out, I left. I had to. Staying would have destroyed me. It took years to rebuild myself, but here I am. He looked at her, searching for judgment or pity, but found none. Christian, Collins said softly, placing a hand on his. I can't imagine what that must have been like. But the fact that you're here, that you've rebuilt your life, it says a lot about you. Her words touched him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, he felt understood. Meanwhile, miles away, Claire's life was falling apart. The small town they lived in didn't forget scandals easily, and her betrayal had become the subject of gossip at every corner. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she sorted through bills. Claire, we can't keep this up. We're barely making ends meet. Claire paced the room, her face pale. I know, Mom, but what do you expect me to do? Christian cut us off completely. Nicholas can't hold down a job, and the kids won't even talk to him anymore. Margaret shook her head. We made mistakes, but Christian, he's cruel. Claire stopped, glaring at her mother. Cruel? Don't even start, Mom. This is just as much your fault as it is mine. You told me to keep lying, to pretend everything was fine. And look where it got us. The two women stared at each other, the weight of their choices crushing them both. Miles and Gracie, now teenagers, struggled to cope with the truth of their parentage. Gracie refused to speak to Claire unless absolutely necessary, and Miles had taken to spending most of his time outside the house. One evening, Miles confronted Claire. Why didn't you just tell him the truth? He demanded, his voice shaking. He deserved to know. We deserved to know. Claire tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. Miles, I was scared. I didn't want to lose him, or you, or Gracie. Well, congratulations, Miles said bitterly. You lost us anyway. He stormed out, leaving Claire in tears. Back in Christian's world, things were brighter. One evening, as he and Collins walked along the lake, she stopped suddenly. Christian, I need to ask you something. He turned to her, curious. What's on your mind? Do you think you'll ever let go of what happened to you? I mean, fully let go. Christian looked out at the water, silent for a moment. I don't know if you ever fully let go of something like that, but I've moved on. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just grateful it didn't destroy me. Collins smiled, her eyes warm. I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. He looked at her, realizing how much she'd come to mean to him. Maybe I am, and maybe it's because of you. Months later, Christian and Collins hosted a small gathering at his home to celebrate their engagement. As they stood together, greeting friends and toasting to the future, Christian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. He had rebuilt his life from the ashes of betrayal, and while the scars remained, they no longer defined him. For the first time in a long time, he was happy, and this time it was real. It was a quiet Sunday evening when Christian's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, expecting a routine work email or a message from Collins, who was out picking up dinner. Instead, The notification displayed a name he hadn't seen in years, Claire. Christian frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. He hadn't heard from her since their final confrontation years ago. Against his better judgment, he opened the message. Christian, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. Please, just hear me out. He exhaled sharply, already feeling the weight of the words she hadn't even said yet. Against the backdrop of his new life, her intrusion felt like a shadow of the past trying to creep in. The message continued. I've lost everything. Nicholas is gone. The kids barely speak to me. Mom's health is failing, and I can't escape the guilt. I don't expect you to care, but I need you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. Please, Christian. We were wrong. I was wrong. Can you ever forgive me? Christian set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the lake behind his house. The water was calm, the surface reflecting the soft hues of the setting sun. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, not the betrayal itself, but the years he had spent rebuilding his life after it. Collins returned a few minutes later, balancing 2 takeout bags. Hey, she said cheerfully, setting the bags on the counter. Dinner is served. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Christian gestured to his phone. Claire messaged me. First time in years. Collins raised an eyebrow as she unpacked the food. What does she want? Forgiveness, Christian said simply, his voice calm but firm. Collins paused, glancing at him with curiosity. And what are you going to do? He thought for a moment, then reached for his phone. I'll respond, but on my terms. Christian drafted his reply carefully, the words coming to him slowly but deliberately. Claire, he began, his fingers steady on the screen. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. That's something you'll have to find within yourself. You made choices, and now you're living with the consequences. I've already moved on. I hope you find peace, but your actions aren't my burden anymore. Goodbye. He hit send and placed the phone back on the counter. There was no rush of satisfaction or vindication, just a quiet sense of finality. Collins handed him a plate and sat across from him at the dining table. Feel better? She asked, her tone gentle. Christian nodded. Yeah, it's not about her anymore, though. It hasn't been for a long time. I just needed to close that chapter, once and for all. Collins smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You know, that evening, after dinner, Christian and Collins sat on the deck overlooking the lake. She curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sunset. Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of it had happened? Collins asked softly. Christian considered her question. Sometimes, but then I remember how much I've learned because of it. It hurt more than I can even explain, but it showed me who I am. And if I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't be here now. With you? Collins smiled, tilting her head to look up at him. You really mean that? He nodded. I do. You're the reason I know there's still good out there. That love can be honest and real. She kissed his cheek. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you found me too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Christian felt an unfamiliar but welcome emotion, peace. Meanwhile, miles away, Claire stared at her phone, rereading Christian's reply over and over. Each word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into the guilt and regret she carried. She sat alone in the small apartment she now shared with her ailing mother, the walls seeming to close in around her. Margaret called out weakly from the bedroom. Claire, can you bring me some water? Claire sighed, wiping at her tears as she stood to fulfill the request. Her days were a cycle of caregiving and loneliness, punctuated by moments like this, where the weight of her choices was unbearable. Miles and Gracie, now adults, rarely visited. They had made it clear that while they loved her as their mother, they couldn't fully forgive her for the lies that had shaped their lives. Nicholas had disappeared years ago, unable to face the fallout of their shared betrayal. As she handed the glass of water to her mother, Margaret looked at her with a mix of guilt and sadness. Did he respond? Claire nodded, her voice breaking. He said he's moved on, that I have to live with what I've done. Margaret sighed, her frail hands trembling as she held the glass. He's right, you know. We made our bed. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet. I thought maybe, after all these years, he might. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Margaret placed a weak hand on hers. Some things you can't fix, Claire. Some things you just have to carry. Back at the lake house, Christian stood on the deck, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky. Collins joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You ready to come inside?" she asked. He smiled, pulling her closer. "In a minute. Just taking it all in." She rested her head against his chest, and they stood there in comfortable silence. For Christian, the past was no longer a shadow hanging over him. It was a distant memory, a lesson learned, and a bridge burned. The future stretched out before him, bright and full of promise, with Collins by his side. And as he looked out at the calm water, Christian knew one thing for certain. He was finally, truly free.